Next, we're going to hear from Gordon Chang, one of the country's preeminent experts on China and particularly on the relationship between the United States and China. Gordon is the author, among other books, of The Coming Collapse of China. He's thought long and hard about the policy of engagement that has been pursued by successive US governments and businesses and the financial markets for decades now. He too has been sounding, I think, the clarion warnings about these policies of engagement and the real dangers that are associated with them. I fear that many of those warnings were not heeded before now, but they're certainly in need of a very fresh and earnest attention on the part of both government and our population more generally. And Gordon, I appreciate so much you joining us to talk a bit about how you see what has happened to date with the coronavirus, the sorts of involvement of the Chinese Communist Party that Sean talked about, and the kinds of implications for our public health as well as national security that this sort of microcosm of the supply chain dependencies that Rosemary has discussed so clearly in connection with this medicine situation, where we are now, in short, and where we need to go from here, as you see it, with respect to the policy of engagement specifically and our relationship with the Chinese Communist Party more generally. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Frank, and thank you to the committee for including me. In recent weeks, the Communist Party of China has revealed much about itself, and we're going to start on Tuesday, because on Tuesday, China attacked the dollar. The Global Times, which is controlled by People's Daily, the most authoritative publication in China, said that Beijing might start dumping US treasuries. We got to understand that dumping the treasuries, attacking the dollar, is an attack on the US financial system, of course, and an attack on the US financial system is an attack on the global system. Unfortunately, this was not isolated, because yesterday, Global Times again started to warn the world about a depression in the United States. Well, a depression in the United States is a depression in the world, and a depression in the world, of course, is a depression in China itself, because China has an export-dependent economy. And of course, China is dependent on capital flows. In other words, it's dependent on countries like the US investing in China, because China doesn't have a sustainable model. It continually needs money from the outside. Now, in a sense, maybe we shouldn't be too surprised that China is trying to collapse the American economy. But this is a China that wants to take over the world. And to take over the world, the last thing it should be doing is attacking us because of its dependence on everything. So we should remember what China is doing. And to do this, I think that we need to see China's plight. And to see China's plight, we should look at the Chinese economy. China's economy in the January to February period was obviously in contraction. This is important because January and February constitutes about 60% of the first quarter of China's output. People are saying, well, China's economy fell 13% in the January-February period. And that's aggregated because of the shifting Lunar New Year, and that causes distortions in the numbers. So generally these 2 months are aggregated. So people are saying, oh, it fell about 13%. Well, that looks a little bit light when we look at the underlying indicators. Probably fell somewhere in the neighborhood of 20%. We know, or we can suspect, that there's some recovery in the Chinese economy in March. They're saying that about 70% of China's workers are now back at their job sites. That sounds a little bit high, but could be correct. But we do know that China right now is in a very stressful situation. Now, to highlight China's plight is important because China cannot recover without strong demand from the world, and especially strong demand from American consumers and businesses. So what's occurring right now is China is doing something which is directly undermining its own interests. And when national leaders undermine their own interests by attacking the United States, which makes it impossible for their own economy to recover, we've got to be concerned that something is very wrong at the heart of the Chinese political system. Over the last month and a half or so, we've seen senior figures in Beijing criticize openly, publicly, in very sharp terms, leader Xi Jinping. And that is an indication that there's dissension at the top of the Communist Party. There's a number of things that could be happening. Our friend Arthur Waldron, the great China historian at the University of Pennsylvania, says, look, China's communist experiment is just about at an end. There's no further place for them to go. And he talks about this process of disintegration which we saw with regard to the Soviet Union in the last half decade. You know, we don't know when China's economy will fail, when the Chinese political system will fail, but we can see important things that are occurring right now in Beijing. And one of them is that apparently the party has lost much of the support of the Chinese people. We know this because with the death of Dr. Li Wenlong, which Sean talked about, he died on February 7th. He was one of the Wuhan 8 whistleblowers who tried to warn Wuhan and the rest of China about what was going on. When he died, there was white-hot anger in the Chinese populace. You could see this across social media platforms. And unlike other earlier instances of Communist Party malfeasance, people in China started for the first time in a decade or so to actually talk about fundamental political reform. Because when his death was announced, people were starting to say, and the hashtag became popular across China, WeChat, and elsewhere, that we want fundamental reform. We want the right to speak. Also at that time, we heard the Chinese people start to adopt as their anthem the song, "Do You Hear the People Sing?" That's that politically impactful song from Les Miserables. It is the song that the people in Hong Kong adopted as a means of protesting China. So we can see that the Communist Party right now is at one of those junctures where it has lost support. So what is it trying to do to regain support? Well, unfortunately, it's lashing out at the US. As Sean talked about, there were a series of tweets from the Chinese Foreign Ministry in the most irresponsible terms. The Foreign Ministry, since about February 5 or February 6, has been on a campaign to tar the United States in connection with epidemics. But it really came to a crescendo on Thursday, because on Thursday, you had a Foreign Ministry spokesman call out US officials as quote unquote immoral. And just before that, that Foreign Ministry spokesman, as Sean said that patient zero was an American in America, and said that it looked like the virus, the coronavirus, was spread to Wuhan by the US Army. And the way this was put, it was intimating germ warfare. At the same time, we saw another Foreign Ministry spokeswoman. She then twisted the testimony of the head of the CDC, Robert Redfield, to show that the coronavirus was American in origin. And Frank and everyone, we've got to understand what the significance of this is, because on Friday, the following day, the State Department summoned the Chinese ambassador to the US to protest this highly dangerous disinformation campaign. But that didn't work, because this week, China's ambassador to South Africa has repeatedly tweeted out these conspiratorial theories, which are completely baseless. And all of this shows that China is doing a couple of things. We can sort of, as Americans, we sort of ignore Chinese propaganda, especially when it's ludicrous. But we got to remember that the Communist Party here is preparing and justifying in its own minds of the senior leaders the right to use force against the United States. And it's also trying to prepare the Chinese people for the use of such force. So, this is exceedingly dangerous. Now, I don't think that China's going to lash out at the US, certainly not in the near future, but it could very well do so, because what it's doing is it's putting into place all the elements of conflict. Now, in this conflict, we've got to understand that this could be history's last great war. We see all these dangerous elements in place. We have to fear what's coming next. Let me just leave you with one point, and that is that in our disagreements and what we're seeing with China, we got to remember that we do have some important allies. And these important allies are China's most immediate victims. Of course, the Chinese people, the Tibetans, Uyghurs and Kazakhs, people in Taiwan, people in Hong Kong. These are people that we should be reaching out with, because China's challenge against us is an existential one. Xi Jinping believes that he's the world's only sovereign leader, that China's the world's only sovereign state. That reduces the United States and other countries to mere subjects. We have to understand the fundamental nature of this challenge, look for our allies, and be prepared to defend ourselves, as everyone has said recently.